Let's welcome Dr. Tristan Brandhorst, Fellow, Medical Microbiology and Immunology, University of Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin.
Hello there, and thank you for coming to my talk. Without further ado, allow me to introduce you to the pesticide I've studied for the last 5 years. This is fludoxonil. It was invented in 1993 by the Ciba-Geigy Corporation. It was originally derived from pyrrolnitrin, which is an antifungal secreted by Pseudomonas bacteria. Since its invention, it has enjoyed a relatively clean official reputation. Its purported mechanism of action seemed to suggest it would be free of toxic effect in off-target organisms. It was originally designed to be applied to seed stalks to prevent mildew, but the market and applications for fludoxonil have expanded exponentially. It is now extensively used in foliar and post-harvest treatments, and its most commonplace use is in soybean agriculture, followed closely by fruits like berries and citrus species. In 1997, Ciba-Geigy proposes that the accumulation of cellular glycerol is responsible for the toxicity of fludoxonil, and that it targets an osmoregulation pathway called the HOG1 pathway, not present in mammals. Solid proof of this conjecture was not forthcoming, but this mode of action has been touted in subsequent publications and advertisements, and likely figured in the decision by the EPA to license its use on a wide variety of produce items. After all, if this purported mechanism targeting a pathway that was only present in fungi was genuinely responsible for fludoxonil's toxicity, it would be essentially an ideal fungicide. Animal testing of this pesticide seemed to confirm that fludoxonil by itself was not toxic in concentrations anywhere near estimations of human dietary exposure, but an examination of the literature that has accumulated since then regarding fludoxonil paints a more complicated picture of the truth. If we go back to 1971, they investigated pyrrolnitrin from which fludoxonil was derived. It was seen as predominantly impacting respiration and mitochondria, preventing electrons from flowing to coenzyme Q, and the excess electrons would skitter about and get sucked into superoxide. This was fairly well established at the time, and it fits with the fact that there are many instances of subsequent work showing that oxidative stress went hand in hand with fludoxonil action. But this is strange. The original goal for the inventors of fludoxonil was never to alter its mode of action, but rather to address pyrrolnitrin's normally rapid decay in the environment. They were successful in this. Fludoxonil was incredibly hydrophobic and unreactive, its protective effects persisting for weeks after application. So many research articles on fludoxonil agreed there were flaws in the mechanism proposed by Ciba-Geigy Corporation. In 2007, they found disruption of glutathione homeostasis, which manages stress from a lot of different reactive species, enhanced the toxicity of fludoxonil synergistically. This suggested that there was a stress response involved, not the osmoregulation aspect. We will be talking about glutathione again, so keep that word in mind. In 2008, in Botrytis cinerea, the safe osmoregulation pathway is not found to be involved in fludoxonil sensitivity. It doesn't exist in Botrytis cinerea, but in its absence, the fungus remains sensitive. So given this, is there a possibility that fludoxonil presents a threat to human health, since the safe mechanisms have been shot down? Well, yeah, in 2012, they looked at its effects on human glial cells and neuronal cells. When they were incubated with fludoxonil, there were reductions in membrane potential, ATP production, and cellular thiol levels. Cellular thiol levels are essentially glutathione. We mentioned that earlier. This isn't what we were talking about just yet, but they refer to the same thing. In 2013, fludoxonil was characterized as an endocrine disruptor, and we've heard enough about that problem in this conference already. In 2012, French investigators, Graillot and Audebert, found clear evidence that fludoxonil induced genotoxicity in liver cells, but it was not due specifically to oxidative stress. It was caused by the evolution of a distinctly different reactive chemical stress intermediate. In this experiment, they looked at many of the pesticide residues that are detectable in the French diet. None of the other pesticides evoked this clear response. They're all deemed harmless at the levels they were likely to accumulate in a human being, but fludoxonil was the one lone notable standout. Consumer Reports, unsurprisingly, has been on this for about a decade. They've been telling us that fludoxonil is a problem and should be banned. Apparently, ecologists and limnologists have been very suspicious of fludoxonil, and toxic effects have been postulated on many occasions. Independent investigators have amassed a compendium of worrisome research findings. For instance, this theoretically safe fungicide turns out to be extremely toxic to aquatic animals and plants. The lethal dose in many of these, seen here highlighted, is less than 1 part per million. This means fludoxonil is an acute toxicity class 1. That's the worst category there is. It's odd that its toxic effects would be felt by organisms across the entire spectrum of living species, because we're talking about plants, bacteria, protists, insects, and vertebrates. Also, Myrna Velke demonstrated that to earthworms, fludoxonil is what she described as a super toxin. That's what you call a toxin when you wish there was a category worse than class 1. Many of the 900 plus products fludoxonil may be used upon have tolerances in the range of 5 to 30 parts per million. Some even reach 60 parts per million. Citrus oil is at 500 parts per million, head and shoulders above the rest. Tolerances for fludoxonil residue have basically gone way up, and usage has skyrocketed alongside other newer fungicides. The application of fludoxonil to our food is done by a system they call drench. It's applied in either water or a volatile solvent and dries into a waxy coating that resists removal. Because it is classified as a pesticide but is applied post-harvest, fludoxonil falls into a bit of a gray area. Its application to produce that has already been removed from the field gives it all the qualities of a food additive, yet the FDA won't touch it. This brings us to our own research. And at this point, I'd like to mention, we didn't initiate our research to try and find this toxic effect in fludoxonil. It was quite the reverse. With its putatively safe mechanism, we thought it might be adaptable to use in human medicine, where fungal infections remain a very severe problem. The problem was we simply couldn't prove that it worked the way it was supposed to. The observation that its widely accepted mechanism was invalid gave us some concerns. We began to look at alternatives. In this figure, the overall oxidative stress in response to fludoxonil was measured by a FRET system, or fluorescence resonance energy transfer, designed to respond to such stress. As you can see in panel 1, the treated yeast fluoresces bright blue, indicating the oxidative stress is present. We also looked at genotoxicity in panel 2, where double-stranded DNA breaks are measured by assaying the phosphorylation of histones. In panel B, we can see that 1 microgram per mil fludoxonil causes more genotoxic damage in our yeast model than a 0.9 millimolar hydrogen peroxide positive control. We looked at literally every other possible chemical stress intermediate first with no luck. We went up and down the list of possibilities. The very last stress intermediate we considered was aldehydes. Here you can see that aldehydes duplicate the action of fludoxonil, specifically in fludoxonil-sensitive cells. They did not induce the same toxicity in fludoxonil-insensitive cells. We also found that dimidone, a chemical protectant that specifically prevents aldehydic stress, prevented the toxic mechanism of fludoxonil from functioning. Once again, we looked at all the likely aldehydic stressors to see if they were increased in cells upon exposure to fludoxonil. The last one we looked at was methylglyoxal, because it's produced by only a handful of cellular processes. Most notably, it can build up if something interferes with glycolysis at the point where triose phosphate isomerase interchanges the 2,3 carbon products G3P and DHAP during glycolysis. If DHAP is not converted into G3P, it can break down by a relatively slow non-enzymatic reaction into methylglyoxal. Cells have fairly robust mechanisms to make sure that DHAP doesn't build up specifically because of this. But methylglyoxal is what we detected, and it built up fast. Where was this methylglycol coming from? Something really didn't add up. And I felt perplexed that regulators could have missed a toxic effect that turned one of the most efficient enzymes in the human body into a toxin factory. From the conclusions from our research from 2016 to 2019 were that fludoxonil induces a stress condition, and the hybrid histidine kinase DARK1 is a sensor kinase stimulated to overreact, leading to an interruption of the fungal cell cycle and death in target organisms. The stress caused by fludoxonil is aldehydic stress, which is damaging and insidiously hard to detect because it perfectly mimics the effects of age. And fludoxonil does not act by any of the previously postulated safe mechanisms, but aldehydic stress can explain all of the effects associated with fludoxonil in the literature to date. So remember earlier when I said that fludoxonil led to a loss of cellular thiols? This is where we were headed. Glutathione depletion. We saw evidence in our model system, yeast model system, that the toxic response to fludoxonil was not only reduced glutathione, but chronically reduced glutathione. It is important because most cells strive very hard to maintain levels of glutathione as it is critical for the proper functioning of the mitochondria. Chronic glutathione depletion is recognized as a severe form of toxicity by environmentalists and pharmacists all over, but perhaps not by the EPA. The jury still seems to be out there. But how is fludoxonil causing aldehydic stress and taxing glutathione reserves? We decided to take a closer look at the pesticide, trying to understand the whole story. Its planar conformation and fluoridation seem to confer upon fludoxonil an incredible hydrophobicity. We could only dissolve it in deoxycholic acid in our experimental proceedings. Now, interference with TPI permits the DHAP glycolysis product to build up, and that slowly converts to methylglycol, but we were seeing an immediate increase in methylglycol, and toxic effects were observable in minutes. Fludoxonil did have a weakly inhibitory effect upon TPI, but we reasoned this couldn't explain what we were seeing. So we did a docking study, a theoretical study in silico. We saw that the highly hydrophobic planar orientation of the fludoxonil molecule seemed to naturally find a compatible hydrophobic pit in the dimer interface of TPI. Interference with that same pit in other studies has been shown to prevent the closure of the hinged lid at the active site, allowing water to interact with the transition state of the substrate, rapidly converting it to methylglycol and ejecting this toxic byproduct from the active site. In vitro, when we mixed active TPI enzyme, fludoxonil, and G3P substrate, we evolved a rapid spike of methylglycol. We theorized that this is at least one component of the mechanism of toxicity driven by fludoxonil, not a safe mechanism by any means, not a mechanism that targets an enzyme present only in fungi, but a mechanism that targets one of the key enzymes of glycolysis, which is a process shared by most all life on this planet. As I was reading production notes of the inventors, they mentioned trying to get the pesticide fludoxonil to be more hydrophobic and that this would make it less toxic. But as a biochemist, I wasn't sure I understood that. They administered fludoxonil in an aqueous solution by gavage, injecting it into the rat's stomachs through a syringe. Now, by the thermodynamic laws of hydrophobic solute partitioning, given the choice between solvation and aqueous solution and becoming associated with the mucous membranes of the stomach and the small intestine, where it can be absorbed, a waxy molecule like fludoxonil will partition to the mucous membrane every time. However, in their actual studies that were done by Syngenta and Ciba-Geigy, when highly hydrophobic molecules were administered to rats, they were done so with food. In other experiments, we've seen that waxy materials tend to stay associated with the indigestible components of the meal rather than being ingested. Thus, 99% tends to pass through the rat's digestive system and it is excreted with their feces. If you've ever looked at a blood sample from a person who just ate McDonald's fast food, it's milky white with absorbed fat in chylomicrons. Humans are wizards at absorbing fatty and waxy molecules because we have gallbladders. Gallbladders increase the concentration and volume of bile salts released in response to a fatty, waxy stimulus. Do you know what organ rats do not have? They do not have gallbladders. It seems to me that corporate biochemists are purposefully making pesticides that are non-toxic only in rats. An important aspect of Any pesticide registration is the insurance that it does not convert into another chemical structure, or if it does, these chemical structures need to be tested for toxicity just as the parent molecule is. Syngenta assured the EPA that UV catalyzed hydrolysis did not take place with fludoxonil. But in 2015, Yannick LaSalle showed that fludoxonil was 100% hydrolyzed into an unreported breakdown product by a couple of days exposure to sunlight. LaSalle found that the UV in regular sunlight could provoke a hydrolysis reaction where water split the pyrrole ring at its nitrogen group, forming a nitroso adduct. The LaSalle group didn't have access to animal testing at the time, but it performed a standard Vibrio fischeri toxicity assay. Vibrio testing is standard for environmental toxins, and the product was found to be 100-fold more toxic than fludoxonil. I contacted Syngenta, the people that makes this pesticide and distributes it over the entire planet. They told me that my concerns were being forwarded to the appropriate people and that I would be contacted eventually. I never have been to this day. Syngenta was acquired recently, every single share of stock by the Chinese government, which now owns them in toto, and the Chinese government also refuses to return my calls.
Let's welcome Kim Richman, Managing Partner, Richman Law and Policy, Irvington, New York.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kim Richman. I'm from Richman Law and Policy. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. I'll be speaking about the work we've been doing on behalf of Beyond Pesticides over the years, and we'll in fact be talking about a number of the cases to illustrate the arc of justice that Beyond Pesticides has been successful in litigating. A little bit about Richman Law and Policy. We're a social justice legal organization based in DC, San Francisco, and New York. We have traditionally targeted everything from trans fat to GMOs to pesticides. As of late, we have made a concerted effort to focus upon environmental protection, human rights, and animal welfare. Today, I'm going to be talking further about the theory of change, using litigation as a tool to develop policy. And what cannot be achieved by way of legislation can, in some cases, be achieved by way of litigation. Now, in an ideal world, both the legislation and litigation go hand in hand. I'm going to be talking about how nonprofits, such as Beyond Pesticides and others here, have been successful in creating a very powerful body of law in order to really address a whole host of societal harms. In order to do so, there are certain fundamental tenets to go through. The first, with regards to leveraging private rights of action. The type of consumer watchdog litigation I'm referring to is where a nonprofit such as Beyond Pesticides is able to step into the shoes of a plaintiff and take action akin to, say, the EPA, the USDA, or the EPA. And they are able to effectively act as a private attorney general in addressing a whole host of harms, societal harms, and to fill, yes, regulatory and legislative gaps. This, at its core, is considered impact litigation, to really use the law to make a significant impact when it comes to harms in the society. Third, this type of work is best when perceived in context, when understood as a multifaceted advocacy approach. That the legal campaign alone is not sufficient to really bring about meaningful change. That it's best when it's coordinated with other campaigns, whether they be legislative, social media campaigns, or just general campaigns wherein folks really trying to address societal harm. Moving right along, the legal theory here is very straightforward. Truth in advertising, holding companies accountable for the statements that they make to the general public and to consumers. Using basic false and deceptive advertising law, state statutes across the country in a creative fashion to address a whole host of harms has proven to be quite successful in really, frankly, addressing issues when it comes to systemic problems in society. And that using basic laws, whether it be in California or New York, or namely in DC, where they have amended their consumer protection statute to give nonprofit statutory standing that has proven to be quite effective in terms of giving power to nonprofits to really address issues in a meaningful way, not only on behalf of consumers, but the general public at large. The beauty of using truth in advertising law is that you often are able to get out in front of certain issues before perhaps the science catches up, regulation or enforcement, in fact, takes effect. And so using this reasonable consumer standard, you're able to really almost act as a canary in the mine rather than waiting for a personal injury claim to arise. And so with regards to the reasonable consumer standard, it's often based upon, frankly, the evolving preferences of consumers. In this day and age, there are, in fact, a growing number of conscious consumers. We, in fact, represent many of them, along with, of course, nonprofits and progressive businesses in terms of addressing larger societal harms. I'm going to jump in shortly to the number of cases that Beyond Pesticides has been litigating over the years. And it has effectively been operating on this concept of moving upstream to address often issues in and around our food systems. We have started with a very targeted market-based approach, products that are sold over the counter, and have gone further upstream to, in fact, targeting actual petrochemical companies and beyond. As you see here, there are a number of companies that Beyond Pesticides has taken issue with. And I'll talk about how each and every one of these companies represents this larger arc of justice when it comes to the work of Beyond Pesticides. Some of the initial work, as I referenced, with regards to over-the-counter products, this market-based approach, this direct action in court against the industry has proven to be wildly successful. Nature Valley granola bars, as many of you are familiar with, had made certain 100% natural claims. However, the product was tested for levels of glyphosate. As many of you know, glyphosate Roundup was traditionally used as a weed killer. It was then, of course, used for Roundup-ready crops such as corn, and then ultimately used as a desiccant in order to bring certain crops to market more quickly. Now, the problem, of course, spraying Roundup on a crop pre-harvest results in often a situation where it does pop up in the end product that's sold in supermarkets, as was the case here. And so with regards to addressing glyphosate, largely in the oat and wheat sector, was that it was not unfortunately limited to such corners of our food systems, but it is in fact ubiquitous, and it was found in products such as orange juice, and tea, and in some cases honey, as was the case here. It's important for folks to also understand that with a lot of this consumer watchdog work, it is best if it's coupled with consumer protection class action suits to maximize pressure upon the company to make certain changes nationwide. This kind of pincer approach has indeed, in theory, been the approach that has been taken with some of these cases. However, it's often a patchwork. There is no guarantee of success. You win some, you lose some, but overall, the theory has proven to be successful, wherein both the consumer watchdog case as well as the consumer protection case has resulted in significant changes. And we'll talk about that a little further. Moving right along with regards to Pret-a-Manger, this was where there was a turning point from over-the-counter products such as Sioux Honey or Nature Valley granola bars to Pret-a-Manger restaurants, fast casual restaurant in this case, that did also make natural type claims, however, contain levels of glyphosate in some of its products. In terms of the further arc of justice that and body of law that Beyond Pesticides and other nonprofits were successful in targeting, Sargento. And so everything from pesticides to antibiotics, of course, plague our modern day food systems. And so with regards to Conventional dairy, antibiotics still, of course, are very much part of the production practice. And through some of our work, we've also discovered it is in the end product. Sargento represents this further expansion of addressing various problems with our food systems. Moving right along with regards to a case involving really at its core certain organic integrity issues. Beyond Pesticides, who has been instrumental over the decades in defining, frankly, the organic standard, USDA organic standard, has unfortunately observed situations where there are issues where negative inputs have entered the system. When it comes to an emerging industry such as cannabis, it's important that it is set on the right trajectory. And this was a case that was the result of Organic Eye, the investigative arm of Beyond Pesticides, creating a report that called out a host of companies for organic integrity issues, and it resulted in the litigation here. Again, an example of the multifaceted advocacy approach proving to be most effective. And then moving further up the food chain, so to speak, when it comes to everything from products to services, True Green is a company that services lawns across America that had made certain representations that the practices were effectively safe and that did not contain any sort of pesticides such as glyphosate. However, our investigation revealed otherwise. We took issue and was successful in holding the company accountable. Of course, issues of glyphosate permeating our food systems would not be the case if not for companies such as Monsanto. And so, sure enough, Beyond Pesticides took direct action against Monsanto along with others. And this is a situation where both the consumer watchdog case and the larger consumer protection class action case was successful and resulted in a meaningful settlement. And just as I thought that was the top of the food chain, it would not be for petrochemicals if not for the fossil fuel industry. And presently, Beyond Pesticides is taking direct action against ExxonMobil for certain greenwashing statements and situations where they've effectively represented that they are good for the environment, when in fact the larger company is so far contrary to that. And we are presently in DC Superior Court and holding ExxonMobil ultimately accountable for its greenwashing statements. The ideal world is one in which both the law and the policy go hand in hand. And this is a perfect example where this bill, in which Beyond Pesticides, along with many of its coalition partners, were successful in banning glyphosate in parks and playgrounds throughout New York City. What was particularly meaningful, this work, other than the fact that the law and policy acted as one, was the fact that there was environmental justice issues that were successfully addressed. A disproportionate use of glyphosate was unfortunately used in black and brown neighborhoods, and that this bill has just recently passed. And so again, the success of Beyond Pesticides, as well as other coalition partners in bringing the law and the policy together. And that concludes my presentation for today in terms of the successful arc of justice, the growing body of law that nonprofits have been developing in the recent past, and how this can effectively hold corporations accountable and address systemic issues within our food systems and beyond. I encourage everyone to continue the conversation with Beyond Pesticides and talk about how legal campaigns can be embedded in the overall work that everyone is doing. And I encourage also folks to reach out and contact me should they wish to continue the conversation. I have here my email address if folks would like to drop me a line. And I thank everyone once again. Take care.
Let's welcome Carey Gillam, author of the Monsanto Papers and investigative reporter. U.S. Right to Know, Oakland, California.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important conference. I wish we could all be there in person, but we are in a different world now, and everything seems to be virtual, and we're adjusting. It's been a long, hard year, certainly, as we have struggled through the pandemic and as we've learned really some very critical issues, lessons about our own health and how vulnerable we are to viruses such as COVID. And I think that we've also learned some very important lessons about what I hope to talk about today, which is how sick we are really becoming, how we are allowing our air, our water, our food, our soil, and our very selves to become so contaminated with environmental toxins that make us weak and make us vulnerable to viruses as well as cancers and other diseases. And that's what I hope to talk about today. So I call this a conversation about accountability. And I say that because for the past, far too many years, decades, accountability has really slipped by corporations that peddle dangerous chemicals and products, with little regard for human and environmental health. Regulators have not been held accountable. Regulators who put protection of corporate profits over the protection of public health. And all of us as well, we need to be more accountable. We owe our children, we owe our grandchildren, their children, and all of the generations to come a healthier future than the one that they're currently facing. Okay, how do I make this work? Okay, in my first book, Whitewash, this was a quote that I used at the beginning of the book. Agriculture is our wisest pursuit because it will in the end contribute most to real wealth, good morals, and happiness. And that is what we've always thought and hoped for agriculture. But what we've seen instead is what we call the insanity of so-called modern industrial agriculture. We're not seeing real wealth and happiness. We're seeing corporate control of seed germplasm, availability and pricing, herbicide dependence, soil degradation, water contamination, the loss, of course, of species and pollinators, and as I mentioned, the rise of cancers and other diseases. Pesticides are at the heart of this insanity in agriculture. These are some not so fun facts. Over 1 billion pounds of pesticides are used in the United States each year, 75% of those in agriculture. 5.6 billion pounds of pesticides used worldwide annually. And this one is, scary. The USDA estimates 50 million Americans get their drinking water from groundwater that is potentially contaminated by pesticides and other ag chemicals. And pesticide residues, sadly, we know the USDA and FDA puts out reports every year about this. Pesticide residues are commonly found in, all of the foods that we eat. Most foods we're feeding our kids, our families, our lunches and dinners. We find pesticide residues in fruits and veggies and even in infant formula. I've written articles about FDA documenting glyphosate residues even in honey. One recent government report put residues of 115 different pesticides found just on bell peppers. Sadly, pesticide exposure is linked to cancer as well as an array of other health problems. You have scientific research showing pesticides connected to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. The famous, Roundup cancer trials and litigation that's been ongoing is all over non-Hodgkin lymphoma associated with glyphosate and Roundup exposure. You also see all these other types of cancers and diseases, Parkinson's, reproductive problems. We also know that there are pesticides used in agriculture that are particularly dangerous or detrimental to children and to their brain development. And our government, there are factors within our US government and really brave and important and knowledgeable scientists who have been trying to tell us, that we need to be more aware and cognizant and address these environmental toxins if we want to reduce cancers and diseases. Cancer has become far too common. I'm guessing everybody out there who's watching or listening either has suffered from cancer themselves or knows someone, has a family member. struggling with cancer or perhaps has died from cancer. It's touched my own life far too many times, and most recently my own father died of cancer in October. He had a very aggressive glioblastoma and died 41 days after his diagnosis. We're seeing the number of new cases of cancer per year worldwide rising from 18 million to about 30 million expected. And the number of cancer-related deaths is climbing as well. World Health Organization data shows us that cancer in young children, certain types of cancer, is increasing around the world. And of course, it's not just cancer. Parkinson's disease. There are people that, scientists that are telling us that we have a pandemic now of Parkinson's that is on the rise. And they say that this is, again, environmental toxins, herbicides, including one that's pretty widely used called paraquat, and other toxic chemicals. Paraquat exposure is associated with 150% increased risk for Parkinson's disease. And I'm sure you know Parkinson's disease is neurological. It is extremely debilitating and affects people's lives profoundly and often leads to extreme debilitation and death. These everyday chemicals might be leading us to our extinction. This is another speaker for this conference, has authored this incredible book, Shanna Swan, Countdown. This is chronicling just these infertility, a drop in sperm counts, rising human infertility. She warns in her book of dire consequences for our entire species. And she points to growing exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals. These are found in plastics, flame retardants, other products that are commonly found in our homes, and in pesticides. And science, as she points out, shows that even in very small doses, these substances pose real danger to unborn babies and young kids. There's a really good example, of endocrine disrupting chemicals used in agriculture, this pesticide called chlorpyrifos. Many of you out there are probably familiar with this. This battle has been in the news for many, many years, decades actually. The science is so robust, showing the harm that chlorpyrifos does to young children's brains, that it's been banned from household use. But the Dow Chemical and the pesticide lobby has been so influential that they have managed to wrangle our government into allowing for it to continue to be used on food, so that children and all of us really are still exposed to this chemical, despite the fact that it's known to be neurodevelopmentally damaging to our kids. There was a recent court ruling just last month in April, at the end of April, in which a court judge, yet another court judge, has ordered the EPA to take action on this. And he is saying, this is an egregious delay by EPA that has exposed a generation of American children to unsafe levels of chlorpyrifos. The Biden administration has said that it's going to do something. It's looking at this. This chemical may soon be banned or have its use extremely restricted. This is a story I wrote about, and many people did too, not too long ago. DDT exposure. DDT, which has been banned for decades in the United States. We're still seeing health impacts multi-generations later. This is a study that was done. This is out of California. These are women who had their blood serum collected back in the 60s. And researchers have followed not only those women, but their daughters and their daughters and their children. And they're seeing health effects, detrimental health effects, still impacting the granddaughters of these women with breast cancer, increased breast cancer risk factors. Barbara Cohen is one of the authors of this and has been leading a lot of this research. And you can see, she's saying it's nearly impossible to avoid exposures to many common chemicals that are endocrine disruptors. These are words of warning from Barbara here, as well as a couple of other very noted scientists. But you can see here, Barbara Cohen is asking, what is our DDT now, right? You know, DDT's been banned, and all of these years later, we're still seeing people suffering the health impacts of that. So what are we going to be looking at 20, 30 years from now and saying, my gosh, what did we expose everyone to? She says, we're flooding the world with chemicals that may have the capacity to cause harm years down the road. We're not devoting enough research funding to track the impacts. You see, Linda Birnbaum, US regulations have not kept pace with scientific advances showing that pesticides and other widely used chemicals cause serious health problems at levels previously assumed to be safe. Linda Birnbaum is one of our most esteemed and most respected international scientists. She ran the National Institutes for Environmental Health Science for many, many years. She ran into trouble during the Trump administration because they did not appreciate the warnings that she was trying to issue, and she's now retired. And you see this quote here as well from Chuck Benbrook, scientist and executive director of the Heartland Health Research Alliance, which is looking at the impacts of herbicides on women, pregnant women and their children. And you see that he is warning of a public health train wreck that comes ahead because of a rise in herbicide use in agriculture. It's very hard to escape exposure to pesticides. This is another problem. More than 90% of Americans have pesticides in their byproducts in their bodies. This is shown. It's ubiquitous because you are exposed to it not only through the diet, but also some pesticides are found in air samples, rainfall, the water we drink, the food we eat. The United Nations has called for recognition of all of these problems, called for a global treaty for more stringent regulation and phase out of dangerous pesticides. The signs are all around. The experts are telling us, you know, we need to do something about this. Pesticides are very dangerous to human health, and it's misleading to claim that they are vital to ensuring food security. It's not just us humans at risk, importantly. You've seen this reported probably many times, insect apocalypse. Some people are referring to it. Intensive agriculture is driving a huge decline in the insect population. And while some people think insects are just troublesome or bothersome, we know scientists tell us how important, how critically important they are to our biodiversity. Birds are also vanishing from North America. The researchers show us staggering declines that we're seeing in songbirds and a number of other birds. And again, we are hearing our scientists tell us that this can be attributed to wider use of pesticides, which is impacting the habitat and you know, the water and the plants that these birds are exposed to. So I guess the point of all of this right now, right, is that we're on the wrong path. As I said in my introduction, we are not creating a healthier world for our kids. We are setting them up for pain and disease and infertility and suffering. These are 3 commonly used pesticides in agriculture. You can see what's associated with these: glyphosate, cancer, kidney and liver problems, reproductive; chlorpyrifos, I just talked about that; atrazine, birth defects, low fetal birth weight, reduced survival of fetuses. These are things we're spraying on our fields where our food is grown. Roundup, glyphosate is the main ingredient here. I spoke about glyphosate. Glyphosate is the most widely used herbicide in the world. It's most commonly known in Roundup. Many of you probably have heard the news of the litigation. Over 100,000 people in the United States have sued over claims that their exposure to glyphosate-based herbicides made by Monsanto caused them to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And 3 out of 3 trials have been found in favor, juries have found in favor of the plaintiffs. And Bayer, which bought Monsanto in 2018, has agreed to pay $11 billion to try to settle this litigation. But more cases are being filed. There's litigation in Australia as well, class actions, mass tort here in the US, and more cases looking to go to trial later this year. These cases were all filed after the World Health Organization's cancer experts said that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen. And this is a paper research that came out in 2019 that showed that glyphosate is, has an array of problems that are tied to birth defects, miscarriage, preterm delivery, gestational age, as well as some animal studies. This is just more research that shows us that we need to be cautious about this widely used herbicide. And I do think that this is really illustrative and sort of the poster child, if you will, for pesticides generally, that we've allowed this wide use, but we need to have more attention paid to what science is telling us are the real risks associated with these chemicals, such as glyphosate. This is kind of a nifty little graphic. This is just specific to soybeans, but this is showing you that what has happened, because weeds have become resistant to glyphosate because it's become so widely used, and we are now seeing, if I can get this to work, that 2,4-D and dicamba, other herbicides, are now on the rise, being used in concert with glyphosate in many cases to treat weeds that glyphosate no longer kills. So this overuse of glyphosate has pushed the use, you can see, of 2,4-D and dicamba as well. This speaks to the train wreck and the rising herbicides that Chuck Menbrick mentioned. This is another Heartland study graphic, which I think is compelling. This is only specific to corn, but shows the active ingredients that have grown, the toxins used per acre in corn. And this is not only herbicides, but insecticides, fungicides, and seed treatments, importantly, that we are seeing coating the seeds that farmers are planting, that is causing real concern for the environment as well as human health. I mentioned my father earlier and his death from cancer. He spent the last 25 years of his life devoted to environmental advocacy and activism. He was most concerned about climate change. He was also a regular churchgoer, and he helped co-found a group called the Sustainable Sanctuary, which is an organization that invites and encourages churches and church communities to come together and to protect and work for the environment. And this is a statement, a mission statement, if you will, from the Sustainable Sanctuary. And I wanted to use it because I think it sums it up so perfectly. We are all connected, right, to God, to each other, to all of creation. And we really have a God-given responsibility for the greater well-being. It's a spiritual, religious, and moral imperative to be good stewards of the earth. And this is my father with my daughter when she was much, much younger than she is now. I love that photo. So the bottom line, right? This is what we're talking about here at this conference. We must care for the earth as we care for our children. The two are inextricably linked. And when we poison our planet, we poison our children and their future. But if we work to nurture and sustain this planet we share, we provide a healthy home for generations to come. And that is my fervent hope, that we can do that. And here I am again. I'm not very good at this virtual world. But that's my hope. And I hope that we all learn a lot from this conference that is taking place. And I hope that I've provided some value here today. And thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Jay Feldman, Executive Director of Beyond Pesticides. I'd like to share with you our work with communities to transition to organic land management. But before I do that, I'd like to share the context of this program, because the context drives our approach and the critical importance we believe of this effort. The history of pesticides is a story of pesticide substitution. EPA started with its review of arsenic-based pesticides and DDT, and then, as we know, we see the industry and agency going through the generations of chemicals, from organochlorines like chlordane and dieldrin to organophosphates, chlorpyrifos, you've heard of that, to synthetic pyrethroids and neonicotinoids. We're literally playing whack-a-mole in the process of doing this. The risk assessment-based approach to regulatory review of these chemicals has failed us. Rachel Carson warned us about this in Silent Spring. While she was writing about DDT, the organophosphates like chlorpyrifos were emerging as the next generation of chemicals of choice. Of course, Silent Spring provides the framework for our thinking. We were warned that we must consider the impact we are having on complex biological systems when we apply biocides like pesticides, and that we should make wider use of alternatives. That was 1962. It wasn't until 1972 that EPA issued a cancellation order for DDT, with some exceptions. With the Carter administration, the organization I was working for in 1977 launched an effort to collect the field data necessary to develop a farm worker protection standard at EPA. When Beyond Pesticides was founded in 1981, we in the environmental community were focused on right to know. And as signs started popping up on lawns and communities, it became clear that signage didn't stop the chemical use. The pesticides are approved by EPA was a refrain. Long before we changed our name from the National Coalition Against the Misuse of Pesticides to Beyond Pesticides in 1998, it was clear that we must reframe the work, calling pesticide use unacceptable and causing unnecessary poisoning, indiscriminate adverse effects on the fragile web of human health and the environment, as Rachel Carson instructed. So we established a program that has 6 key elements, call them elements of change. Listening and seeing the empirical evidence of poisoning and contamination. Daily, we hear from victims of this. Searching, monitoring, and supporting the science. Elevating public understanding, translating the findings and experience into policy and practice, and then changing the culture and the market, individual corporate behavior. Of course, we must follow the science, tracking the independent peer-reviewed literature, and we make that available to lay people and decision makers. In addition to tracking the regulatory status, we assembled a relational database that links health outcomes to real-world exposure, frightening but essential information. With all the deficiencies in the state and regulatory review process and the unacceptable, slow, really generational pace at which it moves, our focus on grassroots becomes critical to effecting meaningful change. This was captured by the national media in the late 1970s after Mendocino County, California, by ballot initiative, banned the aerial application of the phenoxy herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. You know that mixture is as Agent Orange with dioxin contaminants. Citizens Against Aerial Application of Phenoxy Herbicides contended that as much as 70%, probably more, of the herbicides applied aerially on the county's forests and cattle ranches drifted away from the target area onto water, roads, neighboring property, and people. There was actually an incident in 1977 in which a full school bus of children got sprayed. The initiative was upheld by the state Supreme Court, but then it was overturned by the state legislature with language that preempted local authority to restrict pesticides. In the town of Casey, Wisconsin in 1985, same situation. Every time the Christmas tree grower on the edge of town sprayed pesticides, the spray drifted into town and everybody was exposed and many got sick. The town adopted an ordinance that actually limited his ability to spray in a manner that caused drift. And that started years of litigation, ending up in the case you're familiar with at the Supreme Court, which upheld the right of local jurisdictions to restrict pesticides under federal pesticide law. The court pointed out, however, that local authority was governed by state law. So the industry took their case to the state legislatures across the country and successfully preempted local elected bodies from protecting its jurisdiction's air, land, water, and people, including vulnerable populations. All but 6 states were preempted by state law. And where the local democratic process is robust, particularly in Maine and Maryland at this point, the industry is relentless in taking or trying to take a local authority away, either through changes in law or through litigation. And don't think that they're not working all angles in seeking federal preemption of the local democratic decision-making process, because they are. They nearly got a preemption clause in the last Farm Bill. And within the last several years, the Utah legislature voted to preempt. For the chemical landscape industry, this challenge to pesticide use of chemicals registered by EPA is just not acceptable from their perspective, of course. At one time, they launched a campaign called Project Evergreen and started advertising the fight with the gloves are off campaign. Here's what they said. Sound familiar? Because of activists, extremists, and misinformed politicians, consumers are questioning whether the products and resources such as water used to care for their lawns, landscapes, and other green spaces are a waste or a harm to the environment. We responded with a Get a Grip campaign message. The chemical lawn care industry is worried that the word is getting out on the basic hazards of lawn pesticides. So they are attacking environmentalists and health advocates. The facts speak for themselves. Rather than simply saying the pesticides are safe because they are registered by EPA, although we expect to be attacked with misinformation, the industry is using tactics to undermine the science, as Carey Gillam writes about in her book, The Monsanto Papers and Whitewash. With this, they also try to introduce doubt into deliberations of local decision-making bodies questioning the science. So we shifted from right to know that you're being poisoned with a yellow flag in your yard to pesticide-free zones, declaring by example that beautiful landscapes can be managed without toxic chemicals. And we established some victories with a range in depth and breadth, from aspirational statements of sustainable practices, protection of waterways, restriction of schools, to clear prohibitions with limitations on specific toxic pesticide use. We've tracked 185 local policies that span the gamut across the country on our US map of pesticide reform policies. In this potentially transformational moment in history, where we are as a society talking about systemic change, it's fitting that we dramatically change the systems that pollute and poison our communities. So we shift to organic, recognizing that organic eliminates petroleum-based chemicals and synthetic fertilizers, manages soil health, and maximizes sequestration at the same time that it combats climate crisis and biodiversity decline. Yes, biodiversity. We have dedicated funds to help underwrite the cost of bringing to communities a horticultural viewpoint through a horticulturist, and working with the advocates and the community. We also partner with forward-thinking corporations like Natural Grocers and Stonyfield nationwide, as well as organizations like Bright Cities and their Healthy Babies, Bright Futures program, who bring resources to the community. So there are real opportunities here for collaboration. Because terms like natural and misrepresentation of concepts, whether it's sustainable or integrated pest management, are rampant, clear definitions are required in policies. And because we don't want to increase the burden on local governments, we rely on existing law for definitions and updated science. So we have model language with definitions so there is no misunderstanding the spirit and intent and the community values and principles behind these laws. This is not just a technical issue, however, and mere coordination with the parks or the public works departments isn't sufficient. Our programs require that where there's community support, we will see success. And so local advocates put together the elements of a program that builds local support. And these next slides really hone in on that. Coalition building, whether we're talking environmental justice groups or medical practitioners, scientists, landscapers, support for leaders who come from all walks of life. This is Paula Rogovin, a teacher in the New York City public school system, who launched a campaign that engaged parents and the area's New York City council member to advance legislation that passed the city council unanimously on Earth Day this year. Through this, we shared challenges, successes, and strategies. Advocacy can't be understated. Community hearings are critical. And showing your support helps spread the word, as this landscaper from Connecticut does with signs and bumper stickers pasted over his truck. Once the community successfully engages with the decision makers, we are ready to sign a good faith agreement through our program, and we call it an action plan with the town, at which point we will commit resources to beginning this organic land transition program in the community. And then the organic transition begins with an evaluation, training, plan development. We take soil samples, evaluate soil texture, soil chemistry, soil biomass, and microorganisms. We get out on the field, or recently we use remote information and dig into cultural practices, aeration, irrigation, cultivation, overseeding, mowing. And we do this with the people that are doing the work, and organic compatible input materials based on soil analysis and the plan requirement are considered. Then the community is ready to take credit for this commitment and the important change it is embarking on. A joint press release goes out and the project is off and running. When the community does this kind of thing, we look more holistically at what organic land management really means. And this slide really shows us that organic has a holistic impact and this is an ag slide, of course, but it relates directly to soil management. As you know, communities and their local leaders increasingly care about their carbon footprint, how they are working on, the climate action issues, their climate action plans or resiliency plans, their ethical questions around the impact that decisions are having on fence line communities where the chemical they are buying are produced. There is disproportionate risk to city employees who use toxic chemicals and those who use the park. And this program brings the community together through a holistic solution that meets the existential crises of the day. At the same time, in collaboration with grassroots successes, we bring our message to the federal and state level. It's a powerful message when it's supported by grassroots. And these successes and deliberations are critical to deliberations at the state and national level. The only option is an organic future. So let's work together on organic land management transition in your community. Please contact Beyond Pesticides about our organic land management program. Look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.